Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this artist lecture, which we're doing as part of the LGBTQ+ celebrations on campus at Foothill College. My name is Ron Herman. I'm the Dean of Fine Arts and Communications, and I'm very excited to have our visiting artist here today, Jamil Hellu, who is a visual artist based in San Francisco. He works primarily with photography, video, and installation. His work revolves around representations of identity, particularly engaged in exploring interpretations of queer sexuality. He holds a Master in Fine Arts and Arts Practice from Stanford University and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Photography from San Francisco's Art Institute. He was awarded the 2015-16 Cala Art Institute Fellowship in Berkeley and was selected for the Artist in Residence program at Recology San Francisco in 2014, joining since then Recology's selection committee as an advisory board member. He received the Graduate Fellowship Award at Headland Art Center for 2010-2011, and he was also granted a 6-month residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris in 2008. He teaches photography in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University, and he is also taught at the San Francisco Art Institute, Diablo Valley College, and in the art practice at the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley. Before we invite him to start, I would like to say that if you're in one of the classes that is offering this as extra credit, if you want to drop your name into the chat, that way your instructor can see that you attended when they review the video. And we'd love to engage you in some conversation afterwards. So please drop any questions that you have for Jamil into the chat. Those will be captured and we will address those at the end. So without further ado, let me welcome Jamil, who's going to share his screen and show us his beautiful work.
Hello. Before I start, thank you for having me. It's always a great opportunity to share my work and connect and see people that I've known and I met in the past and meet new folks. I have a lot of work to show. I sort of created the opportunity of giving talks about the work is really interesting in relation to think about the production, the longevity of the work, and where it started, the ideas that have percolated over time, and where things are right now. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to give an overview of my journey, of my process, thinking about sort of my background, informing the work that I do, and then connecting to a conversation that has to do with the politics of where we live, the ideas of culture, ideas of heritage. So let me just start. Wow. Okay. All right. I'm going to start with a conversation of cultural references, right? And this idea of looking at a map and thinking about a map and where one is from and how things connect in relation to familial ancestry. I was born in Brazil. My father's family is from Syria, and my mom is from Paraguay, which means that I was growing up, I was affected, influenced by a lot of conversation culturally, not only about a larger cultural reference of the Brazilian society, but also the entry point of Paraguayan and South American culture, and then a very strong connection to Syria. I've never been to Syria. My name is Arabic. I grew up with a very wonderful, in a sense, pride for being Arab. So it was something that was instilled from early on through my dad's family. And that manifested so much through the food that we eat and how Arabic food is quite amazing and interesting and a point of connector to family and to community at large. I moved to the United States when I was 19. And I went through the process of immigrant life. My parents later on moved to the States as well. So this process of immigrant identity plays large in my work. And the fact that I also landed in the Bay Area informed so much of my thinking about cultural references and queerness. My mom was a biochemist, and seeing photographs like this, or seeing her looking through a microscope, was very important to me in this conversation of connection to a device. The first camera that my interest in photography, in a sense, came from her. She was always been connected to this idea of looking, having a device looking through something. And so from the microscope to a photograph camera, I think when I think back about how my connection to photography started, an image such as this becomes very important for me to think about this idea of studying something through the lens of a device. I want to bring your attention to the idea of masculinity. And I want to invite you, all of you, to think about what does it mean for you? What is the idea of masculinity? What does it mean? And I have a quote here from José Esteban Munoz, who was an incredible art historian and articulated a lot of ideas to deconstruct this masculinity as a powerful regime that, in a sense, affects not only queerness at large, but affects ideas of femininity as well. There's something very important as we embark on my conversation here on the placement, the weight of ideas of masculinity. I have always been very connected to cinema, and my entry point in art practice has to do with conversation of artists who have engaged through cinema, photography, painting, art at large, to say something about their own personal lives, especially as a gay person, as a queer person. So the work is very much informed by ideas of diaristic, this idea that you, as an artist, can really reflect ideas of your own identity, of your own community, of your own life. So these are very important influences for me as I started to embark in photography. My coming out process is in parallel with my study about art and photography, which means that as I'm studying, as I'm learning, I was very much diving into a conversation, what the artists that were engaging with queer identity or engaging with ideas of express something about sexuality historically. I want to bring attention here, when we talk about homophobia, when we talk about queerness, there's a lot of violence that is part of the subject. And there are a couple images here that relates to that. So I think it's important to bring this trigger warning, right? Because so not everybody might feel comfortable with the conversation, but it's very important for me to talk about it because it has established in a way my way of thinking about how I produce and how the elements that have informed my work. I was in undergraduate when September 11 happened, and on the very morning, my father called me and said, "Shave your beard." And I didn't understand what he was referring. I was like, "What do you mean, shave your beard?" And he was very, and I have a sort of a goatee and a beard since I was 17, since I started growing girl hair. I always liked the idea of facial hair. And it was something very important on that morning to hear from my father this worry about me, right? Because of the way that I look. And it's interesting how this has played out over time because of my name as an Arab name. For many years, I was singled out in airports. It became this sort of this conversation of my face, the way that I look, face ideas of the Middle East, face ideas of fear around the Middle East. So it was very convoluted for me to engage with this process. And then something quite dramatic and bombastic happened for me, which I came to learn about this moment in history that happened in Iran in which two teenagers were hung publicly for being gay, or whatever the terminology is, but it's the idea that they have engaged in a homosexual act. This photograph centered my journey. There's something here that really it propelled my work forward in relation to think about the history that has to do with ideas of
stupid. Yeah, I know.
with ideas of violence, and then going deeper and then trying to understand the iconography that has been created around these ideas. And the idea of also being part of the San Francisco, the Bay Area culture large.
Scat.
Hello, someone. Hi, I'm gonna stop for a moment. Someone. Yes, I think we fixed. Sorry. Can you hear me okay, guys? Hold on. Okay. But the idea of living in the Bay Area and understanding also the history of San Francisco large and this beacon for queer people to come and realize themselves, to feel safe in a community that expands and continues to expand here. So this is all having formed my work tremendously. And the way that I started to sort of emerge in that conversation is to just to think about my own life. I have a husband, a partner for 17 years now. And through this work, it was very instrumental on thinking about so much violence that we see, especially in the news nowadays, right? It continues. There's this cultural and historical references, but there's also the conversation of where one as a queer person situates themselves around all of this, politically, socially, culturally. And my work starts to evolve in a conversation of what if I represent my life and create these moments that has to do with the mundane of two men living together and coexisting together. And this idea that privacy, right, or intimacy could be expressed through photographs. This work is also sort of pre-social media. So there's something to be said about the social media has augmented, really has developed so much a conversation of this idea of intimacy that's now seen publicly. But for me, the work also engaged in a conversation of looking at the history and looking at the history of photography, the history of art, and think about this iconographies references, iconic references for me to think about people using their loved ones to express themselves through the work, right? And then that give me more sort of empowerment for me to think about my own life and my own husband, my own partner as someone to be represented through my work. This idea of a message, the idea to communicate something to the viewer. And within that, in around 2012, 2013, I started to invite people from my own community to engage in a conversation of identity, being represented through mythology or through superhero references, and ask people to create an archetype, and having them to have their, in a sense, the agency to put a costume together and to say something around this idea of portraying themselves through mythological references for the camera. And it was very interesting for me, this process that has opened for me in relation to think about community, think about giving people the agency to represent themselves, right? So these collaborations, in a sense, a very important part of my practice to this date, and I'll show you further examples of that in a moment. A very important moment in my career was a residency that Ron mentioned early on in his introduction about Recology, artist residency program, that I'm still part of it, part of the board. And this was extremely important to me in thinking about activate materials and thinking about color and think about ways that I haven't photographed before and think about the change that happened cyclically in relation to people passing by or people through a place, right? Such as the large Bay Area. And what this residency did for me as well is this idea of having access to the people's stories through objects, right? And photograph what I found, but then also this idea of constructing and putting things together to talk about a conversation of culture, a conversation of the discourse of sexuality over time, and this idea of identity being constructed, right, for others to see, to think about it. And this work also centers my journey, in a sense, I'm going to use that word journey, of self-portraiture. This idea of using myself in the work more and more to speak up about issues that I find important to speak up. This also, it's a very important piece in the scope of my work, because it, in a way, it made me think about ways to activate the photograph. I'm going to show you the video. So there we go. There we go. A full minute of this ideas of identity through hats and wigs. And through that, this idea that of creating representations that has to do with an active message against so much homophobia that we queer people receive and encounter over time, not only locally, but internationally, right? And this idea that through government, through people meeting in a room and signing a document for the next 100 years, right, to prohibit something. There's something very important in the conversation of queer people fighting back and confronting these ideas. And my work, in a sense, speaks a lot to this agency that we have, right, to confront, to challenge, and to question, right? I think the very important conversation is to this idea of questioning, right, what's happening and why the threat. In 2014, something very dramatic happened as well in the history of Syria, right? As the war in Syria started, and thinking about the impact of the larger and new, in a sense, most recent Syrian diaspora, right? Of people leaving the Middle East and embarking in journeys across the globe to find a safety, right? Because of the war. And then through that, I started to think about my own Syrian and Middle Eastern identity in more depth in relation to activate that through my work. I collaborated with a wonderful photographer in the Bay Area called Carrie Orvik, and to make a tintype. And I wanted to something that had to do with this object that we carry. And it was the first time that I ever shaved my facial hair into a mustache, making a homage to my grandfather and the way that he always had a mustache. And this image was very important to me in thinking about Middle Eastern culture and think about a conversation that has to do with these ideas of borders, right? And so their work started to center so much in the conversation of the conflict that exists of queerness and Middle Eastern Arabic background. And this imposition that has to do with violence that puts people to hide themselves, right? But behind the veils, there's a law going on. There's a law that happens when people start to figure out a way to express their own identities, right? Either publicly or not, independent of government, independent of violence. I'm going to show you a video. There's sound, and the sound is activated by the wind. So you're going to hear this like, and it's part of the work. So. And this is the force of the wind. In 2016, I had the opportunity to have a solo exhibition in Oakland at a space called Aggregate Space Gallery. And within that opportunity, I thought so much about a conversation of water and electricity, to think about cultural references in this idea of conflict, right? That has to do with someone's identity and someone's background. And I then created this.
So Jamil,
Yes.
excuse me for interrupting. For the last video, the sound was not on. So if this video includes sound, I don't know if it does or not, but you might want to make sure that I think there's a setting when you share a screen.
Oh, my apologies. So the previous one is so if you didn't hear the sound, it's just very much the wind being activated there. And here, can you hear sound on this one?
No.
So it's just the sound of the water. So it's just
Okay.
as I'm passing through the water, it's just the sound of the water. But I think for me here, what I want to make a point is the conversation of making references of the liquid, of water, right, and electricity. So. Okay, moving forward. In the conversation of cultural references, I made this piece called Smoke. And thinking about my own cultural background and thinking about the impact of others on my life. And when I say others, I mean my own husband, whose father was a gay man in New York City in the 70s, and someone who died of HIV-related illness. And when he passed away, I inherit his own leather gear. So there's something about culture being passed on through generations and through the person that it's part of my own marriage. And what I'm wearing here is the leather gear, the chaps, the harness, things that were part of in a sense, father-in-law history. So I created this piece called Smoke, and I made that into a lenticular printing, which is very much speaks to sort of religious iconographic images from the 70s of putting images together, that when you look from one side versus the other, the image, you see one side of the image. I'm going to show an example right now of an exhibition in 2017 at Penn State University. it's hard to and complicated to talk about violence, right? To talk about ideas that has to do with the past, and it seems connected to the future that's coming. It just feels an ongoing battle, right? And think about what's happening in Florida right now. It's a constant negotiation for one have to navigate around the denial of someone's identity. And then I reach a moment in my art practice that something starts to shift. And for me, and instead of focusing so much on the violence, right? On what if I start making work that has to do so much about connection, that should with the other side, has to do with idea of how to amplify, in a sense, ideas of queerness through visibility, and think about the past, but a way to combat and confront and dismantle the weight of this past. I made this installation thinking about the impact of the Victorian era in a society at large, in our lives. Think about European imperialism and colonialism, and how that has affected so much the conversation to this day that we engage culturally. And I put this together, part of the CALAR Art Institute Fellowship that I received, and it was a way to learn about techniques, new techniques in my work, and expand my work in conversational installation. And there's something very important for me in what this work represents, of subverting ideas that has to do with historical, homophobic, racist, framework. Something interesting about the work as well as evolving. In 2021, I had the opportunity to participate in an exhibition in New York City in a place called Apex Art. And through that, this idea of creating a new energy into the work. So being a guest has to do with the idea of sitting on the taboo. And here we have opportunity to invite the audience, the viewers, as they enter the gallery to step on it, right? Most recently, I participated in an exhibition as well at San Francisco State University, and I was able to realize this body of work that I did in 2017 that has to do of putting together and mixing the way men and women traditionally wear the headscarf, and thinking about a conversation of how people tend to understand or think about the Middle East or the East at large, right? Through so much stereotypical point of views. And then I started to think about the impact for myself in relation to the way that I've been engaged in American society at large, and then creating this body of work that in a sense put a mixed, that you cannot pinpoint exactly where is the cultural reference. If you haven't ever heard of this book, I encourage you to read it, to explore. There's so much that it talks about in relation to the system at large of oppression that has engaged with this idea of how to look at the West from a point of view of how to look at the East from the point of view of the West, and how our understanding of the East is so much affected by so much stereotypes. And this book really dives into a very, very important and a profound study around not only so the arts, but politically, economically. So there's a system in place. And a conversation system in place, there's a conversation of Trump, right? And what's happened politically when Trump emerged to power, and how so much protest happened in 2017 and to this day, right? There's so much conversation of this idea of the political, right, enforce racial, sexual, and even economic discrepancies and further oppression. And again, as a queer man, as a queer person, as a queer human being, right, reading this news, it is bombarded all the time, right? How to think about that in the work. And that led me of a journey of connection. And I created a body of work from 2017 that I ended 2022 last year called Heals. And here I started to get away from my own community and meet people from different communities, from different queer communities of the Bay Area, and ask them to participate with me in creating a portrait that's a collaboration and engaging on their own cultural references, on their own cultural backgrounds, and create an image, a portrait that can visibly talk about, address that. The idea of someone, for example, growing up in baseball, in sports, right? And now having a role model about representation related to queerness. This binary that is part of culture at large, from sports, politics to various broad range of references. And then thinking about the history of photography, right? From the very start of engaging with these practitioners in the arts that has used the photograph, the camera, to talk about idea of sexuality, ideas about race, ideas of sexism, and how to fight over, how to say something that has to do about pointing into the discussion. I often think about this idea of fight. What is with the artist? What we fight, right? I think it has to do with a lot of conversation of pointing to a discussion. Right? Point to discussion in this case of race, right? This idea of identity formation, that you can start thinking about the impact that we see from media large on how we understand and construct and define our identities. And this is sort of a global conversation. It's not just local or something that has to do with the history of the United States. It's a very big part of the conversation in relation to people looking through art making a way to address visibility, to address a conversation of placement. And by study, by looking, by thinking about these ideas, informs even further my own work, right? And then in Hughes, what felt very important to me is to add a caption to the photograph. This idea that gives the viewer not understanding what they see and might infer visually, but then by reading, make you think even further in the conversation of what is it that what's being expressed through the work. Just mindful of the time here. He's got sugar in his loafers, his father used to say. And then when Ramakona and I had a meeting, we're like, let's show the sugar. Let's visualize that. And how everyone has different ideas of how to portray themselves, how to talk about and address a conversation of oppression. There's something very amazing about seeing the people that I photographed with, seeing their work and the way that they explain, in a sense, put into words for others about their experiences. This is a post from Instagram that Gisela posted to talk about their own feelings around being seen through a photograph, through a presentation of their lives. I love myself. Something very wonderful here. And through the work, through this idea of colors, through this idea of diversity, I created quite a big range, in a sense, of cultural references, mixing depending on the people that I photographed. And I made 69 collaborations across 4 years. And 69 was a very important number for me. If I were to stop, where do I stop? How many collaborations do I make? 1969 is a very important year in the history of the queer movement, right? The idea of visibility. And 69 is sexual reference, right? But it's something of conversational duality as well, or two people together. It's hard for me to talk about my work without talking about the information that I receive, that we receive, all of us, right? All the time around this conversation, right? And think about where we are right now politically, right? And how, as a queer person, how to navigate all that. Again, how to negotiate the political conversation. I saw this, someone as a friend sent it to me, the screenshots that we make, right, of things that grab our attention. And something very important that's being expressed here. And this really struck a chord in me in relation to the idea of meaning, you know, this journey, that what we're trying to do and try to figure out and try to exist. In 2020, with all the craziness of the pandemic, I started to think about the impact, right, of cultural references with the mask, right? And thinking about what's happening politically, what's happening in the conversation of how to deal with this virus, and this idea of creating works at home and trying to say something about what's going on and try to figure out, try to fight. The idea of Black Lives Matter and the impact in our lives, right? The impact of the conversation at large around race, right? And thinking about in my work, this ideas of justice, right? Part of the Avatar series led me to this lady justice. How to represent justice? What is justice? How is justice as being given to us as an idea, right? How does it work? It's so convoluted. And I feel like since the pandemic has been a shift for all of us, right? Of thinking, of understanding our own realities, but also how to think about a conversation of identity as well. And thinking about this, a moment of a lot of transition, of transience, right? And so the work kind of evolved into this speculation for me of being into the studio, right? To point to moments of transition, of fluidity. My relationship with reading is interesting. I go to moments that I don't connect, and I keep looking for moments of readings that can inspire me. And then I find books that it take me and inform so much what I'm thinking and how I think about my work. And there's two books by the same author, with a British critic, behind a place called Autograph in England. These books have been very instrumental in how I think about my practice now in the conversation of race and representation. And I highly recommend. This is why I'm actually putting here in the slide for you. And thinking about not only about being formed by what I read, right? Because I search in books, but also the conversation culture at large, through Instagram, through social media, and how people are able to articulate these ideas, right, into these sentences. And right now, I am on a project, I'm embarking on a new body of work that has to do with lady justice, and kind of really staying with this idea of lady justice and thinking about the iconography of lady justice and thinking about this reference that has to do with colonialism, imperialism, and how we think so much about this idea of the other, right? Through what we see, through photographs, through paintings at large. Right? And it has to do with not only queerness, but sexist ideas, right? Think about masculinity, the way I started this talk. And I want to sort of end it in this new body of work. Right? How women have been represented over time, right? How men have been dictated so much a conversation around how the others should be represented. So there's something about my work right now that is leading me to these questions. So I have just started. I'm showing you a very brand new work. I did a residency at a place called the Space Program in San Francisco in February and March. And I did a lot of silk screens and collages. So my work is sort of is being formed by the techniques and about these ideas. And I'll end this talk today on this quote by Bell Hooks. I find very important. This idea that we have to create our own language outside of oppression, of domination. So thank you all for listening to me. And I guess I'll open to Ron. Any questions? Any thoughts? I'm here.
Thank you so much, Jamil. Thank you. So Victoria, were you able to capture the questions in chat, or should I just work my way through? How would you like to do it?
I was able to capture all of them. I believe there were 5 questions.
Okay, great.
Would you like me to just go ahead and read them out loud to you?
Sure,
Okay,
thank
awesome.
you.
So towards the beginning of your talk, Isamu asked the question, how long did it take you to shoot that? And I think they were referring to the photo and the video of the hats, the multiple hats.
Oh yeah. So oh my God, good question. It's idea of there's something very interesting about the work for me. It's the idea of reshooting, going back to the work, and I do this to this day. I do the work, then I see what's being created, and I go back and I revisit. And in that specific photo, that specific shoot, we did about three times, because I kept finding new props, new hats, new wigs, and I have someone very dear to me, who was one of my closest friends, who is my collaborator and worked with me, and he helped me to make that happen as I stay still in front of the camera and rotating all that in my head. So the residency is 4 months. So within 4 months, you have to produce a lot, right? So that's the.
Okay, sorry, I just found one more question. All right, Sammy was asking, seeing the violence that homosexuality is met with in many Middle Eastern countries and the success of your art, how do you find the courage to express so freely your sexuality alongside cultural iconography without fear of possible negative reactions?
That's an amazing question. And whoever asked that question, thank you for that, because I think a lot about it, right? Especially the conversation when I started the work around Middle Eastern culture, and as thinking about violence and this friction, I started to invite, my idea was to invite refugees that I met here from Syria. And I met several, and I wanted to include them in the work, and they didn't want to participate because of that very conversation of fear. And that led me to then insert myself into the work and activate the conversation by self-portraiture. I have a point of privilege because I was raised in Brazil, right? So there's something to be said about that too. So I think in a sense, the privilege that I have of my family not being in the Middle East allows me in a sense, is this way to negotiate these ideas very differently if my family lived there or if I was raised there and continue to go back and forth. So there's something about the privilege of being in the Bay Area, in a sense, that propelled that conversation for me. But as you say, I've got terrible sort of at times, right, message sometimes. People just because, and you just navigate. You have to, right, to, in a sense, not to censor me, but to propel how I think about the work to produce more work. So I think over time, the idea of violence, the idea of homophobia is how do I think about it that I can use into the work, right? Because it's a constant. It's a constant. If you go to the New York Times, you know, a site today, there's so much conversation about what's happening, right? So it's how to filter. And again, I'm producing work that's very personal, right? It's my own creativity. It's my own point of view. It's my own ability of how to tackle this conversation, right? And I think over time, as I look back, as I talk, there's a wonderful opportunity for me to reflect in my career, my art practice, right? And how to expand and think about that. But I feel very open in a sense to synthesize for myself, right? What I encounter through the news, through the media, and then go to the studio to work. One last comment on this has to do of defining for myself a studio that is a safe space. My studio is a safe space for myself, right? To think about all these ideas. So there's something very wonderful for me. The space allows me to express myself. So.
Instructor Kate Yordle asks, as I look at the relationship of your still images to the moving image, I think of the Iranian director Abbas Kiarostami's film 24 Frames. While his are more meditative and your images seem to be calls to action and living. Can you speak more about the relation of the still to moving image in your work?
I reach a point that I start questioning the role of photography for all of us, right? We see images all the time. And this idea of how to activate the photograph, to talk about these ideas, they are constantly in movement. So in a sense, movement in my work has to do with this fluidity. The things are not fixed. Right? Our understanding is our own understanding are not fixed, and how we think about it, it continues to evolve. So the agitation, right, the movement, the flow has to do with these ideas for me. And I'm constantly thinking about what else can I do to make something that static to have movement. I'm thinking I have a show in the fall, and it's interesting because this morning I'm like, I need something has to do with something moving and the wind being affected. That piece of the wind, it was very important for me to in this conversation, right? How to think. That was a video. But that video led me to think more the conversation of adding photographs to GIFs of these animations to create this frequency, right? This vibration.
Judith asks, there is such a sense of theater, acting, direction in your work. Do you have a background in acting and/or theater? And how much directing are you doing when you're collaborating with the images?
When I was 13 years old, I met someone who wanted to be a filmmaker. And that person has played a very important role in my life, right? He's a dear friend, and he's a filmmaker in his own right in Brazil. And we did together acting. I was part of an acting group. Within a year, my father said no more, and he took me out. And my father was always very apprehensive of the way that I show my femininity. And it was very convoluted for me to navigate of this idea of being taken out of acting. And I think in my art practice, allow acting. So there's something interesting on that, psychologically speaking, right? That has become an entry point for myself. Also, I love idea of costumes. I grew up in Brazil, right? So thinking about carnivals, like this idea from a very early age, my grandma put me in a costume. I'm like, I don't like this, but wear it. You're like, okay. So you can engage in that too, right? So it becomes something very, very has to do with growing up, right? And the conversation of color, conversation of theater. So I find a lot of energy in that. So as far as directing, Judith, it's a great question, because I think what I learned so much was how to listen over the years, especially collaborating with so many people, right? How to listen to how they want to be portrayed, independent of how I want them to be portrayed, right? And this idea of us working together in the space. I put a timer. So it's a self-timer, we photograph. I just did a photo shoot on Sunday. It was a lot of conversation of that. So we put a timer, we photograph, then we go back, we look at the work, together we evaluate, right? We think about, and then I am like listening to what people have to say. People have different ideas than I have, right? So then it's a conversation. And then at times I'm like, I'm trying to get to here. What can we do to get to here? Right? I have a background in composition, in a sense, through photography, right? Some people don't have that. Another conversation has to do, some people have never had the opportunity to express themselves to the camera. It's interesting as well in that conversation. Of some of us have had the opportunity, the chance to externalize ourselves through art practice or to art in general. So people come from the very different background, they don't have that. So I actually point to then access that for them. So I feel like there's a lot of fluidity in the way that I work. It's very flexible. Even when I set a rule for myself, I immediately break down. It's sort of an evolving conversation. Stay open, I think. There's something, and I teach this in my classes. Creativity activates creativity. There's something very important of us trying to be creative through art practice. And then new ideas will come. So creativity is activated by creativity. There's something very interesting that expands and expands, expands. So it's an important aspect of that for me.
Claire asks, the costumes your subjects wear are beautiful. I'm curious, do you find the costumes for your models? Are they thrifted or do you make them?
Everything in between. It's such a dance, right? Some people have amazing cultural artifacts at home, right? Cultural dresses that's part of their own upbringing. And it's interesting then this privilege, this honor that I have, right, to wear a sari, for example, that someone has worn in a wedding of a sister, right? So this idea that the people allow me to do that, it's pretty fantastic. But then the conversation of then us together are, going to thrift store, or the idea of you make it from scraps, right? You make it work. And then at times I went and I rented too. So it's very evolving. Each collaboration, in a sense, asks for something different, and I go after it's very personal, that quest. I think something interesting to be said about here is the conversation of intention, right? The intentionality of to go after something to make that happen, right? When I photograph one of my collaborators, they mentioned about having a horse. I showed a photograph of a horse. That's a real horse, right? Like, okay, we're gonna go after a horse to make it work. So it kind of evolves in that way.
Awesome. Jane asks, could you speak a little bit to the significance of the superhero mythology and the divine in your work? Were superheroes something that you grew up with?
I learned how to read by reading superhero comic books. When I was 7, my teacher asked my father to take me to a bookstore and pick anything I want. And I never forget excitement. I was like, okay, I'm gonna. And then I went to a superhero, and through superheroes, I learned ideas of mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology. I was introduced to those ideas through the comic books. It's interesting. Comic books play a very important role in my thinking around the alter ego, around ideas of identity. Right? We are sort of bombarded by these Marvel movies. It's becoming so vacuous in our culture now. But there's something very interesting about the history of comic books that points to a lot of cultural and political issues right? Depending on this, depending of the time that was made. So there's something about empowerment that I find as well through superheroes, through mythology. Right? Mythology is complicated because mythology propagates stereotypes over and over again. So something on that too, right? And that's what I'm thinking so much about now in my work right now, right? Using Lady Justice, right? This iconography to articulate some of these ideas.
Brian asks, in what ways does your work affect the LGBTQ plus community, and what drives you to continue doing what you do?
Amazing question. It affects through visibility, affects through putting out, say you're pointing. Let's talk about this, right? There's something to be said about the photographs, art making that point us to conversation, point us to discussions, right? And so there was the second part of the question. Sorry, Victoria.
And what drives you to continue doing what you do?
When I read the news every day. That's about it for sure.
Okay,
Hold on. And then moments like this, right? There's a conversation, an exchange, right? There's the conversation of the work also activating community, right? That I find very important. So there's something to be said about that too, that propels me forward.
Okay, two last questions. And then also, Jamil, if you have a chance to go back to the chat, you had some really beautiful comments that were shared. So definitely do that. So Susanna asked, do your parents worry about you being so open about your sexuality? And then Lindsay asked, what artist, if any, inspired you in the artwork titled Smoke?
My parents, still a very long journey for them, right? I face homophobia from home, right? And I've been with someone for over 15 years, right? I can count for you the how many times they ask about my partner, right? So there's a conversation on how to deal with that, right? It's a very problematic journey. It's not easy by any means. I'm trying to think about the second. I'm sorry, the last question. The smoke.
No worries. So Lindsay asked, what artist, if any, inspired you in the artwork titled Smoke?
To be frank, religious iconography. That work came from that. That work came thinking about the bombardment of growing up of religious references, and that's how smoke. There's even the idea of smoke, right? There's something about ritual and something very primal, right? The breathing and smoke is related also to war. So there's something on that. But the idea of the lenticular, I grew up with a lot of, Christianity, Catholicism point of references of Jesus, right? With being represented through the lenticular printing, the lenticular process. So that specific body work came from those ideas for me. Thank you all, really. It's just, take your time. I really appreciate, yes. And the students, right, who are ending the year, let's end it strong, right? Finish it strong. It's been a tough year for all of us. So thank you. Thank you, Ron. Victoria.
So Jamil, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful work, and to Victoria for facilitating this presentation and all the other ones that we've had for the LGBTQ plus month. So thank you all for joining us. And also one last thank you to the ASFC for their funding for this presentation. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.